Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. With the very public rebuke of Justin Trudeau by Chinese President Xi Jinping, Canada-China relations is back in the news. It really never went away. Here to discuss China and Asia more generally is Dr. Jacob Kovalio. He is a professor at the Department of History at Carleton University in Ottawa. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. I guess my first question is the rather obvious one given the introduction, but let's discuss Xi Jinping's reaction to Prime Minister Trudeau at the G20 summit. What's your take on that?
Well, I wasn't surprised, to be frank with you, in the sense that Xi Jinping is a very volatile kind of leader, and he behaved towards our prime minister in a manner that is not unusual at all. For example, he had a one-on-one with, actually, the Chinese delegation with the Japanese delegation led by Prime Minister Kishida. And when the Japanese prime minister expressed his concern with the aggressive manner in which the Chinese military had been behaving in the area of East China Sea where the Senkaku Islands were concerned, Xi Jinping brushed him off, saying that is a domestic Chinese issue, which of course it is not at all. And if you have if you draw a broader point of reference, if you consider the manner in which Prime Minister Harper was treated or approached in a very inelegant manner by then Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, that makes us aware of some kind of a pattern, which is one of unacceptable supremacism. In a way, under certain circumstances, it borders on racism, which is the fundamental approach of Chinese nationalism towards all others who are not what they are. On the whole, historically, we have to be very much aware of the manner in which, or the angle from which China approaches those who are not what they are. Until the second half of the 19th century, China did not recognize, didn't even relate to the issue of a state, only civilizations, and only one, the Chinese civilization. The Chinese term Tianxia refers to all that's under heaven in the context of the one and only supposedly civilization having to be respected by all others who are much lower in stature than they are. There has been a very strong revival of this very unfortunate kind of approach, which again, in the context of our prime minister being brushed off deliberately, of course, by the Chinese ruler. And before that, going back to the Hu Jintao era, President Sarkozy of France, again, the very unpleasant other encounters between Chinese rulers and rulers or leaders of democratic countries. For example, at the Copenhagen Conference on the environment, then President Obama was dealt with in a very disrespectful manner. Again, this is a pattern.
So this seems to be you're saying wasn't just a one-off with Prime Minister Trudeau. It's a pattern of how the Chinese leadership deals with foreign heads of government.
Yes, and that extends to even to the behavior of Chinese diplomats, ambassadors. For example, in the case of our country, with two Lus, Lu Shumin and Lu Shaye, who expressed themselves in terms that if the other way, if the situation were reversed, the Beijing would have reacted completely differently and in a very swift way. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that if we want to be respected by others, we have to respect ourselves and never to take anything as something that we have to give in order to sort of get along, if you will. And that is something that is much more pronounced under Xi Jinping, in other words, since December of 2012. And I'd like to add, I like Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, we're going to take a brief break,
Yeah,
Dr. Kovalio. Just hang on there, and we'll
yeah,
come back after the break and continue our conversation.
thank you.
Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Jacob Kovalio. He is a professor at the Department of History at Carleton University in Ottawa. You were mentioning, sir, you had another thought before we went to the commercial.
Yes. It just so happens that next month, on the 27th of December, is the 10th anniversary of two things. On the one hand, the return for a very rare second tenure of the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo of Japan. And one day after he returned to serve for another tenure, which lasted for almost 9 years, he published deliberately and in English an essay which I consider to be the most important position paper that, a prominent leader of an important country shared with the world, because he published
Mm.
it again in English, not very long, at the center of which is China. China, which in the previous 5 years, when he was in the political wilderness, if you will, in other words, the Hu Jintao, had engaged in absolutely unacceptable military and strategic expansionism into the South China Sea, which Mr. Abe referred to as about to become Lake Beijing. And his suggestion to the democracies was to, first of all, to gather together, to cooperate, not in order to go to war with China, God forbid, but in order to make sure that they put up the kind of potential existing resistance that prevent China from its very strong and actually constantly worsening expansionist trends. And that is something that I think we, the democracies, should always remember. He suggested the establishment of something called Asia's Democratic Security Diamond, Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, that has come to be, it's come to be referred to as the Quad.
The
But I
Quad,
think,
yeah.
yes, that we, Canada, should try as much as possible and as early as possible to join in one way or another.
Well, why aren't we a member of the Quad? Why were we not invited to be part of that?
We are a little bit hesitant when it comes to that, and I think for the wrong reasons, in the sense that, for example, if we consider again the situation in a broader context, I think we should attract Japan into the Five Eyes, which is, of course, an intelligence and security interest sharing system that includes the United States, the United Kingdom, of course, us, Australia, and New Zealand. Japan is a precious ally of the democracies, of course, very close to the United States, but then again, so are we. So if we consider this from this particular angle, us having a very close relationship with the United States as well as Japan, this should bring about a closer relationship in strategic terms as early or earlier rather than later.
Do you think that Japan is now, have they crossed a threshold in terms of their assessment of Chinese threats or aggression, if you will,
Yes,
and
very
they're
much
seeing
so.
things very clear-eyed now? Is that
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. You're absolutely correct in your assessment or analysis. And again, I consider the starting point, as it were, this position paper that I mentioned, publicized 10 years ago. And it is of significance simply in the very recent context of two crises, which, although on the in separate geographical areas, and talk about Ukraine, of course, and on the other hand, very close to Japan and to us, Taiwan. These are two crises that should enhance our awareness of the need for the democracies writ large to reach ways of cooperating in a way that would contain and deter, repeat, contain and deter, not only China, by the way, because we focus on China. There's some kind of a what I call a spectator's approach to the Beijing-Washington supposedly competition, and that is not accurate at all. spectator, I'm using the term in a critical or negative way, in the sense that we must cooperate, the democracies must cooperate among themselves as much as possible, with the view of creating the kind of strategic and military balance that would not encourage those who do not like democracy, those who would like to wreck democracies, as China and Russia have been doing internally, in our case, and in the case of the United States, as well as Germany and so on. And the earlier, the better. Because you see,
we're going to just take another break, sir. I hate to do this to you, but we'll be back. Certainly, we've got lots of time to continue the conversation. Please stay with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
You were just mentioning, I guess, alliances and different approaches to Chinese competition and aggression. So please continue.
Yes, yes. So instead of looking at the global strategic situation in terms of these two elephants, as it were, competing for influence and for domination, if you will, we should lower our sights a little bit and consider these two major entities, in other words, China and the United States, in a broader context. For example, the EU, which in and of itself potentially has a lot of clout, not yet at the level that they should. But it seems to me, and I hope I'm not wrong, that the Ukraine situation has created the movement towards, for example, reaching an overall EU-wide 2% of GDP military budgets.
Right.
And when it comes to ourselves, of course, we've been debating this issue in our own country for many, many years, and I think we have no other choice but to go towards this percentage, if you will, that everybody is mentioning. Japan has committed itself to reach this by 2025. If it's going to actually happen or not, I don't know, but I'm inclined to think that it will happen, simply because of the closeness of Taiwan, the very potentially dangerous strategic situation regarding this fellow democracy of Taiwan, and what should be done in order to prevent forcible so-called reunification, which should be completely and absolutely out of the question. But in principle, you were asking earlier, you were mentioning the Quad very correctly.
Yes.
Well, things are not as clear as they seem or should be. India, for example, is an official member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is headed by China and Russia. To have India as a member of the Quad, which is not a formal alliance yet, by the way, but at the same time, as a member of the SCO, is the kind of situation that we want to be, or to bring towards clarification as early as possible, and much, much beyond that. For example, I've put together this acronym BIMPAT, which stands for Beijing, Islamabad, Moscow, Pyongyang, Ankara, and Tehran. Of course, you consider Ankara, and of course Turkey is a member, Turkey, the way they would like to be called this way, which is of course fine. Turkey is a member of NATO. At the same time, it is in a very close relationship, both with Beijing and with Russia and with Tehran, which of course should create, again, a situation in need of very significant clarification. Now, when it comes to the Quad, and then there's the AUKUS almost alliance among the United States, Australia, and the UK. That is one where Japan's and Canada's presence would or should be considered earlier rather than later. In other words, this is the kind of geostrategic situation where the manner in which China is advancing in the South China Sea, but way beyond that, because if you consider the entire arch from Japan to the northeast, all the way to India in the far south, Japan has been under constant military and strategic pressure in the Senkaku area, which of course Senkaku is under Japanese jurisdiction in every single respect. I don't have to add anything with regards to Taiwan. The Philippines have been under constant pressure, military and strategic, by China in the South China Sea. Consider continuing all the way south, that is, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, then Australia, and in South Asia, of course, we're talking about India, as well as in the Himalayas, in other words, in the, northern India. There's been a strategic rift there for many, many years. In fact, for the past 60 years, I'm talking about the first China-India War of 1962. So the situation is, in military strategic terms, of the kind that the democracies should tackle with the aim to contain and prevent, or as well as impress upon the other side, first and foremost China, but also others, along the lines of deterring.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Dr. Jacob Kovalio, professor, head of Department of History, rather, at Carleton University. We were actually getting to the point, Jacob, in our conversation where you're talking about what Western countries like U.S., we talked about India, we talked about Australia, et cetera, Japan, how the deterrence can work when facing Chinese encroachment and aggressive behavior. Please continue with your thoughts on that.
It is a reality that many times we tend to either minimize or, worse yet, ignore. If we consider the kind of regime that the Beijing regime is, formally, of course, everybody knows that in October, to be more exact, October the 16th, Xi Jinping supposedly was chosen for another 5-year tenure, which is just for, international consumption. Although the formal name of China is the People's Republic of China, and the one and only ruling party is called the Communist Party of China, and in 2017, on the bicentennial of Marx's birth, the Chinese regime donated a freshly sculpted sculpture of Marx to the city of Trier. That's where Marx was born. For all intents and purposes, and in a non-pejorative, repeat, non-pejorative manner, this is a fascist regime. Specifically,
that's just you're using using it as a form of nomenclature and definition.
Yes, and I have researched the issue, and it appears in an online essay that I have written, among others, the title of which is Dire History Repeated: The One-Party State, Lebensraum Foreign Policy, and Strong Anti-Semitism of the Beijing Regime. That says it all, I think. But to be a little bit more specific, the only real difference between communism and fascism is that fascism allows business, private businesses, private assets to exist. However, the last word when it comes to the well-being of any private company, and China is a perfect example, is the word of the ruler. And the ruler in this case is Xi Jinping. Everything else is completely and absolutely identical. So we keep sort of taking not for granted, but for taking Beijing's word for it. This is not a communist regime. It stopped being a communist regime at least since 1978. And in the 40 years that ended in 2018, in March 2018 to be more exact, it evolved, the regime that is, in a manner that by March 2018, what supposedly was obtained through some kind of an elective process, which is total nonsense. There's no elections, certainly not for the top position in the regime in China. In March 2018, it was decided that when the second 5-year tenure, formal anyway, of Xi Jinping ends, he would be re-elected, so-called, for as long as he wants to be in charge.
Right.
And this is the situation.
So how does deterrence work in that situation then?
Well, there is simply, we have to understand the situation as it really is and to prepare or to deal with it in a manner that would prevent confrontation but achieve containment as significantly as possible. When the pandemic started, roughly actually in October 2019, but formally in March of 2020, Europe was extremely critical of China and specifically, of course, Xi Jinping. Now, I'm talking about the past 2 weeks or so, there seems to be some kind of a semi-backtracking on the part of France and Germany. I'm talking about President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, with regards to them trying to find some kind of a midway between being very careful with what kind of investment, Chinese investment, they would allow in the EU and vice versa. This is something that is probably, well, judging by the past, the immediate past, is not going to work.